to communicate. We have to, we can't be quiet.
Guys, the session is unlocked, so people will be able to enter. I'm in as an attendee, so I can hear what you're saying. So just FYI.
Good, thank you.
I was just about to go a rant about you as well, Donna, just the way you said that.
Oh, don't worry.
I'll go on mute then.
Yeah, let's do that. Good morning, everyone. This is Frank Wouters from the Benelux Business Council, and we welcome you to this webinar on the digital transformation in times of COVID-19, which is co-organized by the Netherlands Business Council in Dubai and the Benelux Business Council in Abu Dhabi. And we have, kind support of PwC with two fantastic speakers. We have Stephen Anderson, who's a partner and strategy markets leader. He's the client and markets leader at PwC in the Middle East and a member of the PwC Middle East Executive Board. And he's responsible for the strategy and execution of PwC's market activities in the MENA region with over 220 partners and 5,600 staff. The second speaker will be Abu Amin. He's Director of Strategy and Transformation at PwC in Middle East. He has over 10 years of consulting experience and has worked in London, Singapore, and Dubai. And he specializes in leading large-scale transformation and change programs enabled by technology. A few words of order. This event will be recorded, so please note. If you have any questions, and we welcome that because after the two presentations, we will have some room for question and answers. Please use the Q&A box on the right of your screen. That's where it typically is. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Stephen. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Cheers, thank you, Frank, and morning to everyone. Delighted to be here, and trust everybody is keeping safe. Yeah, thanks for the introduction as well, Frank. Yeah, I said Stephen Anderson. So I've been with the firm for the last 25 years, and I think this is crisis number 4. I guess we've sort of lived through. So we went through Asia crisis back in the 90s, dot-com busts, I guess 9/11 financial crisis, and we're now in the dual crisis. And I say that because I was actually one of the partners on Lehman Brothers when we were doing the sort of restructuring and rescue of Lehman's back in about 2008. And people sort of asked me, what's the difference between a global financial crisis and the crisis now? And I guess the big difference to me was, even though we were at Lehman's, we were still traveling on public transport to and from work. We were eating in the restaurants. We were probably having a drink or two in the evening, and we were going home and watching football. These sort of things. So the big difference, I guess, from a COVID perspective, is just this breakdown, both from a supply and a demand side. What we'll do in this session is I'll go into a bit more on that around the overall macro impacts of COVID-19 and the oil crash, the dual crisis, and what that means. I'll give a bit of a macro perspective with a particular spin around how that's going to drive an acceleration in transformation. And then I'll be joined by Abu, who'll take that on and talk a little bit more around that, the digital aspect, particularly around the transformation in the workforce. So with that, maybe just jump on. I think, Kate, you're on slide detail, aren't you? Perfect. So we thought we'd start with a little poll. This is using it. So as this thing is about digital transformation, there's a bit of digital to kick you off with. If you go to your phones and you can see at the top, hopefully you can see the app. Just go straight to the website menti.com. If you just type menti.com into your browser, and then if you use the code 715198, doing it myself, and you'll see a little opening question. I like to ask this question, and it's a bit of a theoretical one, but if COVID-19 were to end today, how long do you think it would take to get back to some level of business as usual? it's a good initial digital test for everyone to check they can work their way through that. But it works surprisingly easy. Even I managed to do that, Kate, to register my piece. I'm going to make a mental note of those responses, and then I'll share with you something that we just launched this morning. I think it was the National this morning, where CFOs in the region have put themselves. So we'll see whether we're a pessimistic or optimistic bunch on this call. If we could just jump back to the slides, please, Kate. Perfect. Just pause there for a second. Just go back up, Bob. Thank you. Perfect. So I want to start by stepping back and thinking about life pre-COVID, because I think that's important in terms of getting the macro picture. And as the sort of strategy leader at PwC, we did a bit of work about 4 or 5 years ago looking at where the world's going over the next 50 years. And we came up with these ideas of mega trends. There's big forces that are happening in the world. We used to think death and taxes were inevitable, but these were things that were just as inevitable. We now think of the things that are now inevitable. And they were big demographic shifts, aging populations, youth bulges in places like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Africa, a big shift in economic power from west to east, so gradual shift in economic power back to a kind of equilibrium, continued rapid urbanization, more and more pressure on resources and on climate change. And then the final one would be this rapid rise in technology. And we thought, you know, if there's a thing to frame how the world's going to move over the next 50 years, they were the things. The thing that got wrong in that is that all of those factors were actually hitting today. They're not 50-year phenomenon at all. We're actually seeing those things live as we speak. And we looked at that a year ago, just before, before we go into this situation. We said, okay, so they're happening now. So what are the impacts of those? What are we actually seeing in terms of what's going on in the world? We just jump over a slide, please. Okay, perfect. And we said there are kind of 5 second-order impacts of those phenomena, and that nicely spelt out the word adapt. So the world needs to adapt to these changes, the mega trends. Those changes being, we're seeing a growth in asymmetry, a gap between the wealthier parts of the world, the poorer parts, and within societies, and this erosion of the middle classes. We're seeing disruption, so governments, markets, business models, industries are being disrupted, principally by technology, but increasingly by climate and climate change. We're seeing a big challenge from an age perspective in terms of demographic pressures, putting pressures on an aging population at one end, and then the impact of trying to find employment in particular at the more junior end. We're seeing a rapid increase in polarization, so the forces of those megatrends all hitting are leading down to a breakdown in consensus around the world and a rise in populism. And I guess over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen what's happened in the US, we've seen what happened in Spain, we saw Brexit. Probably as a Brit, I shouldn't get into that, but I think it's fair to say I'm not a huge fan without getting too political, but we saw these sort of things happening. So big polarization, more rise in populism, and a real breakdown in trust. And we've seen institutions, government trust falling. If you look at, do people trust where their data is going? Do they trust where their food comes from? Do they trust how sustainable things are? Do they trust business? And we saw all of these things going down. So we saw these huge, if you like, if you go to the next slide, please, Kate, those factors are driving the world into a great part of what we call a transition. So those factors were meaning both from a national perspective and from a business perspective. You were going through a big transition, if that might be a climate transition, moving to a more sustainable model, like water pressures, you may have energy supply, energy transition, the transition to a platform economy, so moving both your customer interface and your supply chain into a much more platform technology, digitally driven. You're grappling with a more fractured world, so your globalization model particularly from a supply chain perspective, was dealing with populism, nationalism, reshoring, etc., and a big transition in your workforce as you think about those digital transformations that were happening. These factors were all happening back in January and February of this year, and then COVID happened. So we go move on a slide, please. Okay. So if you then say, well, what was then the impact of COVID across those 5 dimensions? Undoubtedly, COVID is having a larger impact on the poorer tier in our societies. It'll have a larger impact on some of those countries. So you'll see unemployment, particularly at the bottom of that wealth pyramid. We're seeing SME failure, and we're seeing a rise in sovereign debt. And I'll come on to sort of how the GDP plays out. You're seeing the strength and influence of those big technology platforms. So the Amazons of this world, the Netflix of this world, those business models that were very platform driven have generally thrived through the crisis, have accelerated through the crisis. We may in the short term off the back of COVID give climate change a bit of a backseat because we're grappling with it. But in all likelihood, we've quite enjoyed the fresh air here in Dubai. I can see the view from the back of Frank in particular there. You can see that beautiful blue sky. You can see all the buildings and the trees in the background. I think generally speaking, people will come out of this crisis maybe in the medium to longer term much more aware of the impacts on climate and with a much more socially conscious viewpoint. From an age perspective, clearly COVID has a disproportionate impact, sadly, on the elder population, but the longer term implications are probably more for the younger generation in terms of the welfare state, the availability to create jobs at that level. We may see even more populism. So we've seen many countries look inwardly, sadly, through the crisis. And you may see, and that has particularly manifested itself from a supply chain perspective. People are looking to obviously control supply chains, bring them back on shore, etc. And then from a trust perspective, we've seen through the crisis how important trust is in your government. How much do you trust what you're being told from a health and from that perspective? Certain governments will come out of this, and industries and businesses will come out of this much stronger, having held the nerve, having done the right thing. Others will be compromised. And actually, if you look at the Edelman Trust data on governments, one of the most trusted governments by its population in the world is here in the UAE, and we'll come on to how the UAE has responded to COVID. But I wanted to just give a macro view before I kind of dive into a little bit more on the implications from COVID's perspective, but that gives a kind of overview. Just to move on, Kate. So what are we now expecting to see here in the Middle East? And we've done a numbers of analysis here, looking at the different scenarios. You'll hear people talk about a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, or an L-shaped recovery, and what that could mean for GDP here in the GCC, and compare that to the rest of the world. And I am going to get to some positives in a minute. I apologize that I've started with some what could be seen as negative mega trends, but these are the facts of what lies in front of us. It's likely when we look through these scenarios and impacts on different countries here in the GCC, and you see UAE there, we're probably already beyond a V in terms of whether the economy can come back as quickly as a V. It's more likely that we're somewhere between a U, but probably looking a little bit more like what I call a Nike swoosh. So a kind of, we come down the U and then we gradually come out in an S curve, hopefully back towards where we started from a GDP perspective. But I want to get onto some of the digital stuff in a minute. So I'm an economist by background, but I'll resist the urge to talk at length around this slide and move on, please, Kate. So we did the other analysis we did on the GCC was then to say, okay, so what are the implications from an industry standpoint? And you can see here we've mapped out GVA is kind of a approximation for an industry's contribution to the national GDP, and whether there's a positive a neutral, a slightly negative, a negative, or a very negative impact on those industries. No surprise that in the GCC, we see aviation, passenger transport, hospitality being badly impacted. The same with entertainment and media. Entertainment and media in the region is not as digital as it is elsewhere in the world, so you are seeing a negative impact there. At the other extreme, obviously things like agriculture, but staples have done quite well. The core of the region's industries are generally in that negative bucket. So if you look at energy, financial services, construction, and real estate, and then in terms of the industries less impacted, telco, technology, healthcare, and some of the sort of more local transportation. I guess linking that back to what I said at the start, those industries are generally ones with higher levels of R&D, higher levels of innovation, etc. And you can see where the shifts are going to go from an industry standpoint. Just move me on, Kate. So this is more my silver lining slide. So I've talked about the GDP down. I've talked a bit about the impacts on the region. I've spoken a bit about this adapt and how that's going to accelerate. So how has the GCC responded? And so generally speaking, I think particularly here in Dubai, where we are today, there's been a strong health response. So yes, we're going to go through lockdown. Yes, we've been through some tough times, but the tail impacts could be less severe than other parts of the world that have suffered more. In the GCC generally, and here in the region, the public sector dominates. So the public sector still has to operate, where in other parts of the world, if you have a more open economy to a degree, businesses will retract quite markedly. The energy transition, there's two schools of thoughts here that says, with oil price down, could that slow down? Could it speed up energy transition? I think energy transition will speed up. That will put pressure on the region to get as much value as possible from every molecule that's in the ground in the shorter term. And it will also encourage the region to work very hard on its massive assets that it potentially has from a sustainability and a renewable perspective. So we'll see that speed up in energy transition. And we'll also see we've also seen there's a lot of dry powder that's still sat in the sovereign wealth funds in the region. And as we saw at the financial crisis, when a number of the sovereign wealth funds became almost the lenders of last resort, that they will step in and make some acquisitions. Unfortunately, they're not doing it in a very smart way. I'm originally from the northeast of the UK. I'm a Sunderland supporter, if anyone's familiar with that. And unfortunately, the PIF is using their dry powder to buy Newcastle United, which is a disaster for me. So I'm trying to use some of my influence to try and implicate or do something around that transaction. But anyway, that's a personal point. So what does that mean? If you went back to 2014 when we had the last big crash in oil, then you saw that off the back of that, the combination of those mega trends that I spoke about and that crash in oil led to the transformation that's happened across many parts of the region, particularly in Saudi Arabia and to some extent in Abu Dhabi and other parts of the region. And I guess to be more positive, what we'll likely see in the GCC, yes, we're seeing lots of impacts today, but you could see the transformation that's been happening in the region over particularly the last 5 years being accelerated. So we'll see more digitization. We'll see a focus on cost reduction and efficiency, but probably more localization. We will see more tax. We'll see non-oil revenue and how do we balance that. They'll have to refocus on private sector growth. We'll have to restructure. We'll have to look at how subsidies work. And we'll have to think very, very smartly about how we use our sovereign wealth funds. Move me on, Kate, please. Just briefly as well, I thought I'd just reflect before I just share some of the CFO findings and give you some further data, and then I'll come to Abu. Just some learnings as we went through that, as we were still in the crisis. You see, I'm working from home today. We're still in the crisis. I just thought, just from a digital perspective, as well as that macro transformation points that I've made, we've also got what have we learned over the last 5 or 6 weeks. or sorry, 2 months, 3 months almost. I think the first one is the level of communication and how you can engage with your employees, customers. I know from a personal perspective, I've never engaged more with people, customers, etc. Through the technology that we're now using. So that engagement, that communication, and how you can do that in a very empathetic way. Things like mental health have become much more important. On change management, I think businesses will they'll look to put a new system in and run some change over 18 months. I think the way we do change management is going to change completely. People are not going to be prepared to wait that long. We've seen when we have to do things, it happens. I think there's also a much bigger emphasis now on real-time data and real-time management. So I don't want to wait till the end of the month to make a decision. I have to make a decision now. So do I have the ability through my cloud infrastructure, through real-time management, through the data, the way I use my data to be able to make those decisions? We've also learned that we can be quite productive. So we can be quite productive working remotely. We can cut out the meetings. I think in February, I had a week where I flew from here on Sunday. I was in New York on Monday. I was in London on Tuesday. I was in Paris on Wednesday, and I was back in my office in Dubai on Thursday. I had 3 meetings. That will never, ever happen again, which is fantastic for me, my health. I think it's good for my family that they see me, but those sorts of, what now do you think that's just crazy? We will not see that sort of thing. Hopefully, we'll see that moving a lot. I guess the other piece we have learned, though, if you're in a service industry or working with clients, it's actually quite difficult to build fresh relationships virtually and remotely. You can, if you have very good relationships and trusted relationships, and relationships are really important, you can then work off the back of those relationships virtually. Very hard to make a first impression. So just some, I guess I've gone macro, there's some micro points. And then maybe just to round my session off, Kate, if you just move us on. Yeah, so we just launched this morning, actually yesterday, we launched the latest CFO survey. So we've done a survey every 2 weeks for the last 2 months to get a feel for where the market is from a Middle East and from a UAE standpoint. And I think actually you guys are fairly consistent with that initial poll question that I asked. So this was a question we asked at the start, which is around, if COVID ended today, what do you think it would take to get back to business as usual? You could see we're slightly more negative here in the Middle East in terms of the majority are pushing more towards a sort of 6 months, 12 months piece, and we're slightly more. You can see where we are from a UAE standpoint. So we're looking at that window of 6 to 12 months, and it's been quite interesting. That window, when we first did the poll, was more at the 1 month, 2 month. It went out to 9, 12 months. After Eid, it came back. People, there was a bit of a bump after Eid. People felt a little bit more positive, and you can see it's just drifting a bit now on talk of second waves, etc. Let me very quickly just take you through some other insights coming from the CFOs. First, one of the interesting points going back to digital was around what are the transformations that are going to happen, and what's been quite interesting is that bottom point there. So, to what extent will you make remote working a permanent option? And you can see globally over 50% of our CFOs. We do this survey around the world and here with about 100 or so on this one of CFOs, and you can see far fewer have said we want to make permanently the option to work remotely. I might come back to that in Q&A later around some perspectives on why we think that is here in the UAE. Keep moving, Kate. I'm going to speed up. And then when we asked CFOs, there was I think 99% said they were going to undertake some cost deferment, as though they were looking, cost reduction, workforce reduction, all of these things were happening. But when we asked which investments are you going to slow down, only 10% said, or just over, very few said they want to take digital transformation. They understand we need to continue to invest in cloud, digital transformation, customer experience, and even fewer said we were going to cut investments in cybersecurity. So we see there are two areas which are going to continue to thrive and probably boom through COVID and beyond, will be digital and cyber. Liana, Kate, next slide, please. And next slide. Perfect. And then just in terms of what will work look like post the crisis, we asked, what have you learned through the crisis? How are things going to change, and how are firms going to emerge, particularly here in the UAE? And there's kind of 4 points here. One, we're going to be much more flexible. So yes, I think we're not going to all necessarily be working remotely. I think the UAE and the Middle East had a different starting point, but level of flexibility is going to ramp up hugely. I think there's now much more trust in remote working. Huge thoughts on resilience. I think firms have been found generally wanting in terms of how can I respond. I've got big banks whose most of their employees don't have a laptop. And so how do you start to work remotely without a laptop, for example? So resilience has got to turn up. Much leaner, so a much more of a focus on efficiency, and customer service is really going to come to the fore off the back of that. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I want to make sure I give Abu space and time. So maybe if I pause there, we'll take questions. Please put questions through on the Q&A as we go, and I will pass to Abu. Abu, floor's yours.
Brilliant, thanks, Stephen. Morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. So really good to be talking to you. I guess I'll just start with, you've had the context from Stephen. So why are we talking about workforce of the future? Why does it matter? And to me, it links back to that final point around digital transformation. We saw how that is, that is going to remain a priority, and it's just going to accelerate, if anything. And the thing that we found consistently, speaking to our clients and in the work that we do, is that the reason why digital transformation often doesn't deliver is because the skills and the capabilities are missing. So you get the new systems in place, you get the new technology in place. If you do well, you might get a level of adoption, but often it's a superficial level of adoption. Has it really changed the way people work in the organization? And we find that typically the answer is no. And typically when you dive into that root cause, it's because of a lack of skills. So that's why we're talking about skills. And we, both Steve and I, we work, as you heard, we work on the strategy and transformation of PwC and do the same thing for clients. So we're not coming at this from an HR lens. We're not coming at this as a kind of a soft, touchy-feely thing. It's real hard-nosed business choices for us in terms of how we think about our workforce. So with that, let me just give a bit of context about where we are today. The thing you'll see on the next slide is the impact of automation. So depending on which publications you read or which academics you follow or which consultants you choose to listen to, the estimates of the impact of automation on jobs is anywhere between 10 to 60%. And I think if you take those sort of outer ranges away, the consensus and certainly what our own economic analysis at PwC suggests is that you're looking at something between 30 to 40% of jobs are going to be impacted by automation by 2030. And the early analysis in the Middle East is that impact's actually going to be higher because of the nature of the jobs that we have here and the types of industries that we have here as well. The other thing that really jumps out, if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, is the impact by industry. So obviously different industries are going to be hit in different ways. And different jobs within those industries are going to be affected in different ways. And the big factors are going to be, does this role use a lot of data? Does this role have a high level of social contact? Is this role, transactional and repeatable, or is it creative and creating, new things? And depending on how you score on those, the types of jobs and the tasks within those jobs get impacted very, very differently. I think for me, probably the big takeaway from all of this is, irrespective of the number, whether it's 30% or 40 or 50, it's a big number and it's going to be pretty disruptive and it's going to come at us faster than we think. So organizations have to get ready today, and that's one of the big takeaways I want to really emphasize this morning. The other thing that you see on the bottom there is we did a hopes and fears survey, 2,000 workers in the Middle East, in the GCC. We asked them about how they felt about automation. And we did the same survey across a number of other territories, US, UK, across Europe, Singapore, China. And the comparison between the GCC and the rest of the world is quite interesting. The headlines are that in the GCC, workers feel more optimistic about the future, recognize the technology is probably going to have a bigger impact on their jobs, but they feel more ready for it. They feel like they're ready to upskill, and they really want to upskill. And I guess a lot of it's playing into the pace of change in this region, how much transformation has gone through in this region, and how it's been able to leapfrog on a number of different phases of transformation, if you like. So I think all of that is a pretty positive picture. You then, when you look at that versus how organizations are enabling their workers to upskill, you actually see that in the GCC, we're doing not as well as places like India, Singapore, or China. So there's a bit of work to be done there. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to, just to give you a heads up, we're going to give you a poll question on that just to understand how you're doing in your organization as well. So that's kind of where we are in terms of automation. What does that mean for the workforce? So if you look at the next slide, we think about it in terms of these 12 dimensions of work. And you can see some of the things that come out in the survey around safety, around productivity, organizational design, and so on. I want to focus on three. I think these are the three that probably are most pertinent to the discussion that we're having today. And the first one is about skills. So we talked about the lack of skills when it comes to digital transformation. The challenge is, the world is changing. None of us know where it's going. We saw those trends, and we can kind of draw an inkling of where it's going. But I don't think anyone can claim to be able to define what that looks like. So that makes it really hard in terms of, okay, well, if we don't know where the world's heading, what kind of skills do we need? And there are some no regret moves that you can make around that, and I'll come on to that in a second. But that's number one. Number two is this point around the transition to remote working that we saw in the survey. So the offices that we have now are no longer places where sit at a desk for 8 hours and then leave again. We need to think much more in a much more sophisticated way about what are the types of people that we have in our organization? What are the type of personas? Who are the desk workers versus the road warriors versus the people who need to collaborate a lot more? And we need to really redefine what offices mean, and the working space means, and what collaboration means for us in the future. When I think about this transition to remote working, I think about what's happening at PwC and what I see with our clients. I almost think about it like if you think about a graphic equalizer. So COVID-19's happened. The highs have gone all the way to the highs, to the maximum. The lows have gone all the way down. And now it's a chance for all of us to take a step back and recalibrate that. What are the things that we really want to amplify and retain? What are the things that we want to eliminate and completely do away with? And really redesign that work experience and the way of working with that in mind. So that's that point around transition to remote working. The third thing, and this is the consistent theme you'll see across all of these, is what COVID-19 does is it doesn't introduce new trends. It simply takes those trends that Stephen talked about and it just puts them on supercharge. So, accelerated unemployment. We saw that impact with automation. We saw that coming, and now that's just going to accelerate. So cost cutting is going to be a major factor in this region and across the globe, obviously, but even more so in this region. And what that means in terms of your workforce strategy is for that leaner operation that you're going to have, for that workforce that you're going to retain, how do you rethink their jobs so that it matches the world that we're heading into? Given that you're going to have a much more focused workforce, that question becomes even more important. So if we move ahead, I think you take all that context into account, lots of big changes coming at us. They're coming at us really fast. But there's actually a big opportunity. there's an opportunity to kind of redefine what work means, redefine the proposition that we offer our employees, and therefore what we end up having, the proposition that we offer to our clients and our customers as well. Number of points on the slide, but if I focus on a couple, we're seeing increasingly organizations thinking about their purpose. They're going back to the root of why they're there and reassessing their focus. You see this in the news recently with organizations getting involved in the supply chain of medical supplies, companies announcing that they're giving back some of their furlough payments, etc., and also some of the broader issues that we're seeing in the news right now. So this is becoming significant. It always has been, but it's becoming so much more significant. So that's one. The other is we're seeing that skills and well-being and productivity are becoming much more of a single conversation. Well-being used to be something that was on the side. You'd have a well-being leader. You'd kind of do it as an HR thing, but now it's skills, well-being, and productivity all together. Because what we're finding is that actually, if you upskill people, you give them better tools, better capabilities, you help them be smarter at their jobs, that should free up their time. And if they've got more time available, how do you help them use that time productively for themselves and for the organization? And that's why that link, which often isn't quite, intuitive, but has, starts to become much, much more important. And then the third thing I'd probably just highlight on this slide, just to wrap up on here, is when you get all of that right, when you get the skills right, when you get this purpose right, when you get people to feel better about their work experience and just their overall well-being, the thing that comes out of it that we're seeing more and more often is this idea of citizen-led innovation. So people feel more empowered. They feel like they've got the skills, they've got the tools to actually drive that digital transformation for the business. Digital transformation isn't something anymore that Stephen and I sit and do in our transformation team. It's not something that our IT folks are doing. We're all involved in it, and we're doing the big macro things. But increasingly, we're seeing innovation and transformation happening with the individual at their desktop, coming with the ideas, getting their team together, and then driving it and actually making it happen. Okay, if we can move ahead. So if you take all of that, what should companies do? What should you do in your businesses or in your organizations? We think there are basically 4 focus areas we need to rethink and reconfigure. The first is strategy. We're clearly in a crisis. We're in a dual crisis. But how do you use that crisis to, how do you sort of manage that crisis strategically? What are the choices you can make today in how you respond to that crisis that's going to set you up to kind of respond effectively to some of these trends that are coming our way? So I think that's point number 1. And within that, there are going to be actions that you can take that are obvious. There are going to be actions that you can take that are no regrets. And there are going to be actions where it's going to be a calculated leap of faith. You're going to have to make a bit of a bet. You might not know where the answer is, but actually the probability of success is relatively high. So I think that's important. And Stephen's point about this real-time reporting becomes really key here. We don't know where the future is going. We can think about our scenarios, and we need to look at the data and be very agile and adjust quickly. The second is workplace. So, this point, I've already touched on this before, but what does working at your organization mean? What does it mean in terms of behaviors, practices? How are you going to drive collaboration? How are you going to take what's good and retain that? And how are you going to, sort of, there are going to be some longer term unintended consequences that may not play out at this stage, but how do you sort of watch out for that and react quickly to it? Our own experience from the research we're doing within PwC and also from the conversations we're having with clients is generally people are saying their productivity is neutral or improved. The relationships are stronger than ever before or neutral. And the people who are saying that those things are negatively impacted sit generally between the 10 to 15% at a maximum. So it seems like there's a lot of upside and a lot of opportunity to go after. Skills, I'm going to touch on the next slide. So let me come back to that. And then finally, the role of HR, we can't ignore. This is I don't know if there are any HR leaders or professionals on the call. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to really put this whole agenda at the heart of our strategy. That's what we've done at PwC. In PwC, we have 4 simple pillars around our strategy, and one of those is exactly around our people experience and upskilling our people for the future. So, have a think about how you take some bold actions and make this really, the heart of what you do. So let's talk about upskilling a little bit, because I think this is important. This is really the thing I wanted to focus on. So on the next slide, often the discussion that's had around upskilling is, we naturally link it to digital skills. We think about programming, we think about coding, AI, emerging technologies. And that absolutely has to be a part of it, but it's just one part of it. And increasingly that it's becoming less and less important, actually. If you're into technology, you're seeing a rising emergence of, no code or low code solutions where any of us with a little bit of capability can build tools that can automate, that can cut out huge amounts of hours and manual effort. So I think that whole digital skills is one part of it, but it's not the key thing. The key things are the skills that actually make us more human, the stuff that AI is not going to be able to do, that the bots are not going to be able to do. And it's the cognitive, the social, and the adaptability. It's critical thinking, it's problem solving, it's agility, it's sort of empathy and understanding. All of those are as important as the technology skills. And the reason why we say that is because with all of this transformation and thinking about the workforce transformation that needs to happen, the thing that is important is that you need to target it at 3 levels. You need to look at it. You need to target 3 levels. One is you need leaders who understand the opportunity, and when they get someone in their organization who comes to them with an opportunity, they understand the potential, and they understand that they can back it, they can invest in it, and they can drive it forward. So that's critical. You need people who are the technologists who are going to actually drive that automation. So it's great to have the ideas, but who's going to build the solution? Who's going to actually deliver it and deliver something that's working? And then finally, you need the citizens. You need everyone in your organization thinking about how this can change their jobs, change what they do, and make that real. So that's why when we think about skills and these digital skills, it needs to happen at multiple levels. Okay, great. So let's go on to a quick poll. I'm going to ask you a question in terms of how you're thinking about this in your organization. So we know that the mentee works. So can you have a think about how? Can you have a think about how in your organization you are providing opportunities to upskill? Are you, if you hear about that stat that we saw earlier in the GCC where employees were saying that they were very keen to upskill, but they weren't getting the opportunities in their organization. Where do you sit on that front? Do you think you're doing enough, or do you think there's much more to be done, or actually you haven't even started yet? Okay, great. So lots of people in the middle column there. I'll give it 30 more seconds for a few more responses. Okay, fantastic. Great to see that lots of people have started on the journey and they're on the way. And actually, one of the things I wanted to come to at the end of this is a digital fitness app and a tool that we're making available that might help you accelerate some of that. For those of you who've started the journey, this is something we're making available to all our clients. We're making it available to the public to help you in that. So I'll come on to that and spend a few minutes on that as well. Great, thanks, Kate. Can we move on to, so look, to summarize, digital transformation needs the right skills. It needs the right workforce. I would just leave you with these thoughts before I talk about the digital fitness app. One is, you've heard from Stephen that the speed of transformation is just accelerating. So we've got to act now, and you've got to think about, the moves that you're going to make now that are going to be no regret, that are going to be calculated bets, that will put you in a good position for the future. We don't know what the future is going to be, but we can make decisions that help us. This one, make a bigger leap, is something that I think is probably one of the biggest silver linings with COVID-19. what COVID-19 has shown us, especially in terms of transformation, is that we for a long time carried hidden assumptions. We've carried artificial constraints about the scale of change and the speed of change we can make in our companies. And I think a lot of that's been demolished now with the experience that we've had over the lockdown. So have a think about how do you take any of those existing constraints that are sitting in your organization and how do you tear them apart and think bigger? So I think that's important. The automation debate, as I've said, it's got to be a strategy discussion. It can't be something that's led by HC or IT. No disrespect to those functions, but it's got to be owned by the top team in the organization. So that's super important. And then finally, think about the people angle on this, right? This is about the talent in your organization. It's not about specific roles and jobs. It's about how do you get the right skills and how do you nurture those skills in the longer term, and how do you bring your people along with you? How do you tell a story about where your company's going and what role they can play in that? At PwC, we often use this phrase that no one left behind. So we will give you every opportunity. We'll give you all the tools. We'll support you as long as you lean into it, as long as you buy into it, and if you do that, you will not get left behind. So those are my sort of 6 key takeaways. And with that, I just want to give you a final 2 minutes on the digital fitness app. So, I touched on this a little bit. We've gone on this journey ourselves to upskill our people in the region, 6,000 people over the last year. We're actually doing this globally, so it's happening, across the world. And we're doing the same thing with a number of our clients. And often the starting point for that, Kate, if we go to the next slide, please. The starting point for that is the digital fitness app. We do a lot of things around accelerator boot camps, digital academies, sort of hackathons, etc. We've done all of those things and happy to spend more time separately. But where we started was this fitness app, which is something that every single person in our organization, all 6,000, took part in. They used it to assess their digital fitness score. So you do a very quick questionnaire and it tells you how well you're doing on it. In terms of, I think the highest score is 420, and then you get a baseline. You can then, test your score within, with other people in your team or your organization. And so it creates this gamification and this level of competition as well. The app also then gives you a learning plan. So based on the questions you've answered, it helps you, with suggesting curated content on things that would help you drive up that score and create your digital fitness across, those different dimensions that I talked about earlier. Not just technical, but also the soft skills, the personality, etc. All those other factors as well. And then the more you engage with the app, you get an opportunity to improve your score. You get real-time feedback. As I said, you can benchmark your scores. So it creates. We use a number of nudges from behavioral economics to create something that's appealing, that's engaging to how people want to upskill today. They want to do it on the move. They want to do it in a bite-sized way. They want to do it in a way that they get real-time feedback. So the app has all of that. And really the thing that I want to highlight is this is now available to everyone. So you're all welcome to go onto the App Store, download it. You can put that code in, LRNALL, learn all, and your personal email address, and you get access to it. And you can share with anyone in your organization as well. The app is being made available until June 30th, 2021. So give it a go. Let us know what you think. I'd love to hear your feedback on it. As I said to you, this has been the center point of how we started our upskilling journey in the organization. And then we used that as a bit of a beachhead and then went on and did a whole host of other things that, helped us kind of close the gap between transformation and capabilities. Okay, I'll stop there. And I think we want to make sure we have some time for Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Abu, and thanks, Stephen. And Abu, I would like to commend your son for being such an eye candy without disturbing your presentation. Stephen, let me ask a question, because in your presentation and some of the data that you presented, there was a bit of a mismatch between the outlook that people have on basically, flexibility, resilience, and how they have come better out of the crisis using all the digital tools and remote working that we are doing, but at the same time, they did not seem to support, full-heartedly this option of remote working. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, Frank. Yeah, we thought a bit about that and sort of dug a bit deeper. I think there's probably 3 factors there. So I think one, from a UAE standpoint and from a regional standpoint, is probably the industries and the type of work that people are doing. So does it naturally lend itself to remote working? So it's pretty difficult to do tourism, real estate, some elements of retail, some energy work remotely. So there's a bit of a industry mix factor at play there. I think secondly, there's capability. So to the extent to which firms in the region, businesses in the region, governments in the region have the ability to work remotely. So how easy that is, particularly to do it securely, in terms of whether they've got that in place. And I think finally, and probably in a way, one of the most, the real thing is really culture. So I think there's a big element of what we'd call presenteeism, if you like, in the region. So unless somebody's sat outside of my office, they can't be working. And I think that cultural bit will shift the most off the back of COVID, because I think generally speaking, COVID has proven that people aren't at home watching Netflix and taking their dog for a walk; they're actually working. And I think that cultural shift is probably speeded up through COVID-19.
Are there any other factors that play a role? For example, I mean, one of my fellow board members on the business council, he's a banker, and he still needs to go into the office every 2 weeks to sign stuff, which is sort of like the easiest thing to digitize. Or even infrastructure. I mean, a lot of the buildings in Dubai, they're rather old-fashioned. You have to, move across floors, and probably it doesn't make a lot of sense to force people to go there because they don't meet each other anyway. So are some of those factors? How do you see that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think infrastructure, and I guess I said that with capability in terms of whether people have gone to the cloud. So whether they, so the bank's a great example. I think I mentioned it in my presentation. People generally don't have laptops in lots of businesses, things that, in a professional services we take for granted. But from a security standpoint, a cost perspective, do you really want your payments guy in one of the larger banks here sat at home on his laptop authorizing millions of dollars of checks? Probably not. So, there's certain pieces like that, and end user computing and all of these things that are factors in whether you can work remotely. I think there's also customers who haven't quite made that transition and want to come in and have face-to-face interactions. So that's going to need to change as well. So yeah, all manner of factors. I think the main point there is we started at a low base in terms of remote working, and our change, like most changes in this part of the world, will happen very quickly. So we will catch up, I think, in pretty short order.
Thanks. So Abu, what are the main takeaways and learnings from your upskilling transformation journey?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So we've, as I said, we've been on an extensive journey. We've been on it for a year now. We've had 6,000 people go through it. We've created 250 accelerators, who are these technologists who will now create the solutions that our people come up with. It's been pretty extensive. I think there's a number of things that I'd reflect on there. One is that point, and it's worth repeating that we made upskilling. We put it at the heart of our strategy, and we ran it out of our strategy team. We didn't run it out of HC. I think that's important. Our as a hard-nosed, there is a decision. If you look at all the calculations, organizations, for the skills that they need, they're not going to be able to recruit them in the pace that they need. Because of the cost of recruitment, and also just the ability, the availability of talent. If you compare the ROI of doing that versus doing, actually retraining your talent, the whole business case is a complete no-brainer. So I think putting it at the heart of your strategy, being quite kind of, evidence-based about it, and driving the kind of financial benefits and telling that story is very important. And then the final point I would say, Frank, is, just getting your people along for the journey and helping them shape that with you. We painted an incomplete picture at the start intentionally. We said, this is where we're trying to get to. What could it look like? And our people joined us on that and helped us fill in the blanks. And that's where this whole idea of citizen-led innovation comes from. How do you get every person, whether they're a PA or they're a director or a middle manager, how do you get every single one of them to think about, how do I help create the organization of the future?
Thanks. Interesting. One of the there was a little nudge in, or a little nugget in your presentation about people with disabilities, and the fact that now we're all getting used to working from home, which obviously could open up avenues for people with physical disabilities for whom traveling is more challenging than for others. Have you done some research, or is there a body of evidence that this whole digital transformation could also play a factor, not just people with physical disabilities, but other disadvantaged groups? How that plays out? Is there something to learn?
Yeah, Frank, I'm glad you've touched on that. There is. So I think whilst my sort of presentation was focused on the corporate and the private sector component of this, there is a broader agenda here, which is, this whole upskilling gap creates a massive societal issue. We talked about how we expect unemployment to accelerate. And that obviously has an impact on businesses. Obviously, if you have a smaller economy, you have less spending power, et cetera. So I think there's a direct economic impact as well, but there's also a bigger societal issue. So one of the things we're doing is we paired up with the UN to commit to $3 billion over the next 4 years and to upskill 1 billion people. And a lot of those will be in areas that are a disadvantage. And I think we're really scratching the surface, because this kind of flexible working, really being tech-enabled, is going to open up so many possibilities for people who are currently excluded, whether it's physical disabilities, whether it's people who can work on a fractional basis. And even we're already starting to see some very creative things, especially here in this region, where there are a lot of expats here who are now going back to their home countries, working remotely for the organization, and it's a win-win. They're sort of having a better quality of life. They're close to their family. They've got more spending power in their home country, and the organization is saving lots of money as well. There is so much to go after in this area.
No, that's fascinating. Maybe as a last question, because I'm looking at the time, Abba, what role do other stakeholders, apart from businesses such as government institutions and local communities, play in this upskilling journey?
Yeah, it's. I think, especially here in this region, I think it needs to be a multi-stakeholder approach. Hopefully you've got across that, Stephen and I, we think this is an important issue. We're really passionate about it. We think it's something that businesses need to think about quite deeply. But to solve it, it's going to need, businesses, it's going to need government, it's going to need people like PwC and, and sort of our competitors to come together, and institutions like this, these sort of forums to come together and really take a broad-based approach to it. So I'd, if anyone on the call wants to get involved, find out a bit more, I'd really encourage them to get in touch with us, and we're happy to discuss more.
And then there is a question by Thomas on the chat box. Are we investing enough? Is his question.
Stephen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's the challenge, isn't it? How do you transform whilst you're under pressure and you're under a cost challenge? And I think conversely on that one, I think you've almost got no choice. So if you don't go through the sort of digital transformation, change your business model, change the way you serve your customers, then frankly you're going to be out of business. So the way to try and work out how do you preserve that investment, how do we transform in that way, how do I, so I think when we spoke initially around COVID-19, there was kind of three phases. There was the kind of mobilize phase, which was get my workforce safe, ensure I've got my cash position sorted, a sort of stabilize phase around customers and probably some more of the operational side of things. And I think we're now, yes, that we're still in that phase. We're having to work out how we're going to see the next paycheck and how we're going to do all of those things. But we've got to move into a strategize phase quickly, because business model is going to change, customer expectations going to change, the way you think about your investment, the way you think about your technology has to change. So getting into that strategize phase quickly, and it's really how do I cycle any investment dollar that I do have into the transformation activities and be honest around areas of my business that are probably not going to be as viable, profitable in the future. Not easy.
Yeah, one of the numbers in your presentation, Stephen, that stuck with me was that 75% of the people in the GCC think that robots will steal their jobs. Well, let's see. I mean, maybe it's the type of people they've asked or felt compelled to respond. But there's one question, and I think that we will have to stop. One of the challenges to digital transformation journey, apart from cultural change or upskill, is legislation. On upskill and ROI, it should be that the smart developer should have responsibility to follow the trainer approach while implementing. Who would like to take that one?
Was that a question or a statement?
Yeah, perhaps it's it reflects on how to do this, and
well, I think it links to I think it links to Abu's point around you have to do it, almost doing it to yourself. So I think the point there is as things become less code driven, as you look to drive the transformation, how do you upskill your own people? Because that continuous transformation, continuous thinking about how I reimagine the way I deliver my services becomes a core part of everything that you do. So yeah, the trainer approach, or to actually get people more heavily involved in the implementation, who are then going to be constantly not just delivering but also transforming as you go. So I think I agree. I think with the question or the statements and yeah, it's an important point.
Yeah, Frank, if I've got a minute, I wouldn't mind sharing an example of that just to illustrate that. So I was speaking to a senior colleague here at PwC last week, and he went through our 6-week structured digital bootcamp. He came out of it, these new skills, etc. And he made a comment to me which was really striking, and it goes to the heart of this question, I think, or this comment. He was saying that he's in his mid-30s, he's progressed up the organization by focusing on business. And the more he's done that, the less he's spent time on his personal development. And having gone through the bootcamp has unlocked the potential of doing that. So he did our 6 weeks, but since then he's been out of it for 3-4 months now. He's done 3 or 4 other things, on his own initiative. And the powerful thing there is that he's done those things on his own initiative, and then he's gone and upskilled his own team on that. So it's kind of, you almost unlock this kind of viral effect but people have it in them. They've got the creativity, they've got the initiative. You just got to give them a little bit of support, and you do that, and then suddenly you just see that multiplying in your organization.
That is a fantastic example. I think also to end it, I would really like to thank you and the team that has supported this webinar on this fascinating topic that is with all of us. I mean, the fact that we have a webinar instead of a physical meeting is testament that it even affects how to run a business council. So it is something that is with us, and yeah, in terms of glass half full, half empty, I think you've given us enough, hope that there is a lot more opportunities out there, and we have to grab it and run with it. And with that, I would like to really, again, thank you very much, and to everybody else. This will be recorded. We'll make it available online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.